So welcome. Thank you to Ashurst for the hospitality, to the Ashurst team for having us. We're very excited about this event. I'll say a few words about Leadership Lab as we get started. So Leadership Labs is a new YPI development series focused on featuring infrastructure leaders, sharing their career journeys, and sharing insights with all of you, the audience. Today, we're starting with the legal perspective with the Ashurst team and featuring the Ashurst infrastructure team here, with more events to come that will also feature different areas of infrastructure, from project finance to infrastructure development, engineering, as well as insurance. So please be on the lookout for these events in the future, as we will have them here in New York City and across the country.
Excellent. And my name is Jack Schwab. I'm the Vice President of Education, and Marco and I have been working on this initiative for probably about 6 months at this point, and it's gone from an idea to finally be what will hopefully be the first of many events here. I'd like to introduce our two speakers for the evening. First, Betty Cerini is the co-head of Ashurst Projects Americas practice. Betty has been a key player in the development of project finance and subsequent application to a significant range of transactions across the Americas, representing sponsors, lenders, underwriters, and other project participants. Betty has unparalleled experience advising clients in relation to the development, financing, construction, and operation of capital-intensive projects, including projects and public-private partnerships in the transport, energy, and water sectors. And then Alexis Rosenberg is our moderator for today. Alexis is a senior associate in Ashurst Projects practice, and Alexis practices primarily in the area of project finance and transport, infrastructure, and energy projects focused on public-private partnerships. Alexis is the former co-president of Young Professionals in Infrastructure, the organization we're all here for today, and has worked across 3 continents, Australia, Asia, including Japan and the Middle East, and North America. So it's great to have we couldn't have 2 better people to talk about the legal aspects of infrastructure projects than the 2 people we have here. So we're very excited.
We can do a round of applause for our speakers.
Well, thank you guys so much for this opportunity, and we're really excited to host the first Leadership Lab. And I promise for the non-lawyers in the room, this is really going to be more about, building a career in this industry that we've all decided to call home. And we're going to do a little bit of a throwback to start to the late 80s, early 90s. So get your heads in like a Wolf of Wall Street kind of mindset.
Big hair.
Yeah, I'm just going to dive in, and we're just going to talk a little bit about Betty's career. So I guess right at the beginning, could you tell us a little bit about what you studied and what was your first job, and did that lead you into infrastructure?
Sure. So I majored in college in economics and Spanish literature, and I minored in expository writing. When I was a junior in college, so I thought I wanted to pursue economics. And when I started looking at potential jobs as a junior, all the available jobs then were the entry-level jobs were in the Federal Reserve Bank, which was, to me, just the most boring job. So I thought, okay, this is not for me. Let me pivot. And so I pivoted to law school. So I had, in high school, I had volunteered in the Manhattan Legal Services. And then in college, I had volunteered with the Public Defender's Office. And I always loved reading and analytical writing. So I went off to law school, and and then, and my first job.
Yeah.
Okay. So my first job was at a deli in high school. Best job ever. And then when I was in law school, I interned as a first-year associate. It was really hard to get a job after your first year in law school. But I wrote 100 letters, and back then I had to type them, right? And so I got a job at a small boutique law firm in West Palm Beach, which was like my uncle lived there, so I could I could stay with him for the summer. And then my second summer, I summered at the law firm, like a big New York law firm where I started my career. And I started my career in litigation, actually.
So I guess it's fair to say that you weren't looking for a career in infrastructure. It was a career that found you.
Yeah, totally found me. Like project finance, which is what I ultimately did, didn't even exist. That name didn't exist in the 80s. It was just sort of it was like the birth of project finance. And so I was in litigation and I really did not like it. It was very like adversarial. It was just my personality did not mesh with the personality of a litigator. I'm sure there are some very nice litigators, but it wasn't for me. And my dad, who's not a lawyer at all, said to me, you never had, to me, you don't have the personality of a litigator. Why don't you try corporate? And so my really good friend in the corporate department said, hey, Betty, there's this young partner who has a ton of work. He's great. He's really smart and he needs somebody. Why don't you work for him? And so it wasn't called project finance. It wasn't called infrastructure. It was just working for Rich Shetron, who was my mentor. And so that started the journey.
So something that we talk a lot about at YPI is about mentoring and about the importance of mentoring and finding a mentor, or the incredible benefits of finding the right mentor. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about that relationship, like who your mentor was, what kind of work he was doing, and sort of what that relationship taught you.
Right. So I was extremely lucky in my career in that Rick Shetron, who was my boss, was literally, if you're all familiar with Chambers, which ranks lawyers, so he was called the grandfather of project finance in this country. So literally we drafted everything from scratch. All the issues were novel issues. We worked through everything. So he was brilliant, but really what stood out in him was his approach to lawyering and to solving issues. And so he was really practical. He was very, very reasonable. His approach was very balanced. And so he took the view that, these concession-based financings, they're long-term relationships. And they really are relationships because the lawyers and the advisors come in at the very beginning, but then they walk away. And then the parties are left with this incredibly complex contract that they have to, and one thing I learned was that everything you think about in the run-up to signing the documents and everything that everybody fights over, and like none of that actually happens. And what happens is a completely different set of events. And so those documents, what he taught me was that, they have to preserve a fair balance. Because when you don't, and we'll probably talk about that later, but, you'll get like 20 million contractor claims or defaults, or you just get bad results because if the relationship is not balanced, it just doesn't work.
Yeah, and I think about something that, we have talked about before is, I think there's a perception of lawyers as like sharks, right? And we're just like out to like screw the other side. But especially in this industry, that shouldn't be the goal. And in fact, like I think something that your mentor taught you is the respect that you can command from everyone on a matter by speaking with integrity and trying to look at the project from a balance perspective?
So essentially, whenever we were in a meeting, across the table from the other side, I mean, he was just so respected that whatever he said, the entire room just went with it, because he just, he gave the right solution. And that's how I learned. And whenever that's happened to me, that to me is success, right? That, you've hit the right mark when everyone around the table can say, okay, this meets my needs.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I enjoy about working with you is that we are looking for like the right solution. And I think people look to you for that. And
Alexis is learning that. I always said to her, there is a right answer.
I think we still disagree on that as to whether there is a right answer, but I
think right answer for the moment, for the context, Yeah.
And I think the reason that you say that is, I think we need to understand that the answer that benefits us, or, the answer that would let me win the argument, is not necessarily what's best for the project, and keeping that in forefront of mind is really important.
Yeah. So, one of the things I learned was really the importance of listening to the other side and really understanding deeply their concerns, because projects, as you all know, is incredibly complicated. There's so many different interests, and aligning all those interests is really hard. So you just have to really listen, and just find creative solutions to the extent you can.
So maybe you can take us back to the 80s and early 90s. What kind of projects were you working on? What was like the birth of project finance like? What were you working on?
So I, in the 90s, did a lot of work in Latin America. So at that time, Chile and Colombia were investment grade, and Argentina, the president at the time was Menem, who was very pro privatization. And so those three countries in particular were quite active, and I was really active in those countries. And in particular in Colombia. So there was a lot of privatization and greenfield projects in Colombia.
And those were mostly power projects, or?
They were power and infra. Yeah.
And are there any that really stick out in your mind as sort of formative experiences?
Yes. So I worked on the Termo Barranquilla project. It was a very large power project in Colombia, in Barranquilla. And it was really complex. So at the time, I think it was like 800 million, which is, this is many years ago, that was a lot of money. And it was really complex. I represented the commercial lenders. So there was an Exim tranche, which had a comprehensive Exim guarantee. So basically, Exim Bank wrapped the commercial risk. There was an OPIC political risk guarantee, backed tranche. There was a cross-border lease, so that the equipment could it was a tax advantage structure. There were 2 levels of guarantee, including the country of Colombia, a nation guarantee that was negotiated. Like one of the, I don't know whether it's a positive or negative of my mentor, was that he was never around. So, I mean, he was around, but all these Latin American trips, it was just me. So it was, and I was young, I was like a fourth, fifth, 6th year associate. doing all of that. And another aspect of that deal that just made it just really, it won at the time, you know, like whatever the awards were for the projects, but it had the equipment manufacturer had recently rolled out a new model of turbines, which in industry speak at that time was considered new technology. It wasn't tested, it wasn't proven. There were only 2 in the world that were working, and the lenders wouldn't accept that risk. So one of the most contentious negotiations of my life was, because we wouldn't accept that risk, was the negotiation of a fleet shutdown guarantee. So basically the situation where there was a defect that was so pervasive, so bad that they had to shut down the fleet. And it was, you know, and so in that instance, I don't remember the specifics, but really the world came down for this equipment supplier. And it was just a horrendous, and it was me. And lo and behold, less than a year later, you'd think that was a pinhole risk. It happened.
Wow.
So that also was a lesson to me to stick by my guns.
Yeah, so you're a young person, kind of early in your career. You're a young woman traveling alone, and then you're in these negotiations with like top bankers and maybe even like politically connected projects and people, and that sounds very intimidating. I'm not sure that I would have been up for that challenge. How did you find the confidence to do that? Like, how did you back yourself?
Yeah, you know, you just think of that you're there, you have to do a job. Like you really have to know the documents really, really well. You need to know the positions because you're persuading people. There was a lot of this was the, you know, did I say that already? It was like the first major project finance in Latin America. So there was a lot of education, like, why are you requiring this? Why are you requiring that? All in Spanish, may I say. So, and, you know, all the documentation, it, you know, it was a lot, but it's like you have to do it. So you have to work hard. You have to be confident. Yeah, I was confident. I don't know. I was confident. You have to.
I think
You have to be.
I think maybe, you know, also coming back to your comments about there being a right answer, I think you have a good sense for, you know, what is the core key elements of, you know, what's being negotiated.
Yeah. To me, in project finance, because we also, like, this is back early in my career, very early on, I represented rating agencies, rating projects, and like the whole first half of my career was lender focused. So they're very, you know, structure oriented. And to me, this idea that the SPV, the sponsor, you know, the project company can't absorb risk that it cannot control. Like, to me, that essence of project finance, which makes it viable from a lending and, you know, investment perspective, that was sort of the soul of everything. And so I viewed everything around that metric in negotiating with like owner versus contractor or lender versus.
And I think, you know, something that I am learning is that keeping that, like the core elements in your mind, helps give you that balanced perspective and helps you understand, you know, the other side's perspective to then have that balanced view when you're advising.
Yeah, because I think that like when owners or developers, when they push that, right, when they're just too aggressive, like I've been doing this for almost 40 years now, so I've seen it, like, you know, come back to bite people. So.
Well, that's a nice natural segue. So we'll move a little bit through the 80s, or sort of start to move, but and maybe sort of ramp up to some of the work that you're doing today. But I wonder if you could, thinking about where we were then and, what happens in the intervening time between then and now, I wonder if there's like an example from some of the work we're doing currently of where the industry has moved to and what the sort of lessons that have been learned over the last couple of decades.
Right. So historically in the United States, infrastructure was funded through public finance, right? And then around 2005 or so, something like that, the US started sort of experimenting with this P3 structure. You already had project finance in the power sector, which I had done here domestically, but P3s, it was the early 2000s. And so initially, owners were very hesitant about the structure. Because, like, just to give some examples, one of the key features of a successful P3 or a P3 is its performance-based technical requirements, right? So that sort of is meant to unlock private sector innovation. But it also means that the state cedes control, right? And so that I just remember initially that was really hard for owners to like put their arms around. Or another example is the requirement for a termination payment. Like, so if the concession terminates, even for the fault of the developer, the state has to make a payment that, should ideally cover the debt. So that was monumentally, like, just, a huge deal for a lot of owners because they're used to public financing, they're not used to these balloon payments. So there have been, over the years, the market has very, very slowly evolved with lessons learned because there have been success stories, but there have also been, big like bankruptcies, like project bankruptcies, but also contractor bankruptcies. So there have been lessons learned, but I would say the market is still evolving. And so to your question, we worked on SR 400, which is a project sponsored by GDOT, Georgia Department of Transportation. And I think that's an example of evolution, right? In that, GDOT sort of moved in certain key risk allocation provisions from a more owner-friendly provision to, something that was more balanced, that gave the private sector more comfort.
Yeah, and I think, maybe that comes back to some of what you were talking about earlier of no matter what perspective that you bring to these negotiations, being open to understanding the other side is a very important part of achieving a successful project like SR 400. And that shows, that evolution that GDOT was open to hearing the market perspective and understanding, when they're getting feedback like this is not workable, that's being said for a reason.
Yeah, and I think that we're in a position now where the infrastructure needs in the US are just so huge that, another part of it is that I think, these owners have more incentive to use this P3 model. And so they need to make it work.
Well, that's a good segue into my next question, which was going to be, what do you think are some of the biggest issues facing the infrastructure industry today? And do we have any good examples of, projects or approaches that are addressing some of those issues?
So to me, some of the major issues are the huge infrastructure need and the constrained construction capacity. I think those are the biggest issues. And so GDOT, which I have now been working on for 3 or 4 years, I don't know how many years, but GDOT is wants to build out the top half of the ring around Atlanta, right? Because, just because they have that much traffic as express lanes. And so we have structured that the construction is very constrained. And it's, I think, 285 East is 45 miles, I think. So we structured it as a sort of hard bid DBFOM, design, build, finance, operate, maintain, and a comprehensive development agreement for the remaining phases. And so what that does is gets us delivery certainty for the initial phase now, but then, delivery certainty that, someone is going to develop a huge portion of that, that road over, the next whatever number of years. And so for us, it solves it helps with the issue of constraint and also ensures, which was a really important goal for GDOT, as few operators as possible on the system to sort of ensure just ease of management and consistency. So we'll see how it works out.
Yeah, I think it'll be really interesting in the next couple of years as more states do embrace P3s, but you have more developers, operating assets side by side or, interrelated assets within the state. I think Virginia might be the only one now that's got, connected roads operated by different developers. Mm-hmm. But, that's going to be really interesting. If the model continues to grow, that's going to be an interesting area to watch.
So we're doing East now, and then we'll be starting on West shortly.
Yeah, GDOT has a very big program. Yeah. What are some of the aspects of the sector that you think people misunderstand or get wrong, and what's sort of your approach to that?
I think that there are just many, many interests that need to be aligned. And, projects are just incredibly complex. There are many, many issues. And I think people maybe underestimate the amount of, time and hard work that it takes to negotiate all these documents, to get them to the point where people will buy in, how much sort of education, persuasion, thinking, creativity. It's a hard process. So for 285, I've been working on it for 3 years. Yeah. And the procurement started when? Like maybe a little over a year ago?
A little over a year ago.
Yeah, so it was like a year and a half before that, just on the government side, preparing, and educating and talking through. So it takes a lot. And it's really important to just make the time, whether you're representing, the owner and you're listening to bidders, or you're the developer, talking to your contractor, who, like, how many contractors have been burned here, here in the United States, just, listening and not, like, I see sometimes people just poo-pooing issues, and, it's just not helpful.
Yeah, I think actually Sam and Sleevy and I and Brad also were in the beginning of this session just talking a little bit about the number of stakeholders on these projects, and the way to have a successful project is really to walk that tightrope of getting all of that input, building that consensus, but there's a lot of different interests, and being in the middle of that is a real challenge. It's a real challenge.
Yeah.
So looking forward.
This is where someone else has to step in. The forward.
You can tap me in, Courage. I'll support. But what do you think? What do you think are some of the most interesting, promising trends for the future of the infrastructure sector here in the US or globally?
I mean, definitely the intersection of infra with tech. So we are most probably going to merge with a West Coast firm, Perkins Coie, effective July 1st. And they are a huge tech firm. So they represent, and they have, I think they've got Jeff Bezos's signature from the LLC that, or, the company that he originally formed. So they represent Meta, Amazon, Google, all of those players. And so to me, that intersection, AI, data centers, all of that world, that a future generation will text. Yeah, why don't you talk about the future?
I think, you mentioned that we're intending to merge with Perkins Coie, and I think for a younger infrastructure lawyer, a lot of the infrastructure of the future is going to either be in tech or be sort of tech adjacent or involve some element of tech, which, to be fair, it has for a number of decades already. When I was in Asia, we were doing deep sea underwater cables for what was then Facebook, is now Meta. But you're going to see more cables. You're going to see obviously more data centers. I don't think anyone in this room isn't thinking about data centers. But also things like the co-location of power for data centers, or for a road project, is it going to be a connected road? Do we need different infrastructure to be facilitating fully autonomous fleets, or fully autonomous, all vehicles in the future? So I think that is going to be a really interesting area for us in this room for the next couple of decades. But what I'm finding is that, some of the core principles that you talk about, from the 80s and 90s, of thinking about what risks can each party bear and trying to be really genuinely open to the other side's concerns, is the right way to approach new technologies as well.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I just, when I started, so I think some law schools actually now have project finance or with courses, but back then that didn't even exist. So it's the same thing. The future is full of unknowns, new adventures.
Is there any capabilities that we are focused on as a firm trying to build?
Oh, so Alexis is focused on building my ability to use a computer. You can tell her about Harvey and all that.
Yeah, well, to be fair on Betty, she does now use ChatGTP, not for work, but she's been using it for, some of her personal life things. So the next step is, as a firm, we're very focused on AI and the potential for AI to improve the way that we work. And so Ashurst uses a tool designed for lawyers called Harvey, but it is, generative AI. And I think that is going to transform the way that we work. But my view, and I think our firm's view, is that, AI isn't coming for your job, but it is coming for the way that we work. and understanding where it can be useful and where it can be powerful is, I think, going to be a challenge that, us in this room are going to face over the next few years. But I am certainly finding it is like a companion, not a replacement. It is enhancing the way that I can deliver my analysis. But in many ways, my analysis still goes back to those core principles. And that is sort of what I'm bringing to the table, is really thinking about, what are the risks, who's able to bear them, how should we allocate that, and then AI can help me, polish up the words.
Yeah, I mean, if there's one piece of advice that I would give, is to really focus on the substance, because I see that, because my daughter uses AI, right? So sometimes it just is quite generic. And it kind of looks good on the surface, and it probably does the trick in a, but yeah, like, you have to, at the end of the day, it helps you, but you really need to know what you're doing.
So I want to leave a bit of time for questions, but maybe one last one from me before we open up the floor. What gets you excited about thinking of the next steps in your career?
Next steps. Yeah. I think what gets me excited, I'm going to ignore the next steps. I think what gets me excited is, I've now lived through a number of generations of lawyers, and just seeing them thrive and succeed, I think that really makes me happy. And then the other thing that makes me happy is, projects that then do well, right? As opposed to projects that,
fall apart. But you've worked on projects that are continuing to serve the public that they were intended for today, decades after they were built.
Yeah. And, like, going back to Thermo Barranquilla, so that debt was paid in 2010. So, the project completely, yeah.
Wow. Yeah.
So
I haven't yet seen any project I've worked on repay its debt. So
yeah, but when it works, it's great to see that your hard work paid off.
So I do want to open the floor to questions, if anyone has questions for Betty or me.
Hi, everyone. My name is Sam. This is my first YPI event. I'm glad it was. This was a really great talk. Thank you for your time. I'm a planner, so I'm not a lawyer or an engineer by trade, and I know that planners and lawyers aren't often in the same room with one another, and I'd like for that to change, number one. Number two, my question is mostly directed at both of you. Have you seen examples of appetite for innovative project finance, like asset recycling in Georgia, for example, something like that?
I would say, I'm not breaking any news by saying I don't think there's anything that's like immediately on the horizon, but I would certainly say that the people that we interact with, as they upskill in understanding the sort of tools available to them, those are definitely conversations that people are starting to have. And certainly it's been successful in, other places.
Yeah, I think GDOT is just in general really approachable and really open, right?
Yeah, it's great.
And both, GDOT, and we also do a lot of work with North Carolina DOT but other DOTs, people are looking at each other and success stories and realizing what they might be able to do and deliver. And so I think like this kind of forum is great. All the conferences we do are great, but like sharing those success stories. I know you were talking about, writing and journalism and publishing things. We talked a bit about education, but people's understanding is continually evolving, and if you get the right information in front of the right person and they realize what they might be able to get done. I'm finding a lot of owners much more open to these ideas than maybe they were a couple of decades ago.
You see a lot of owners now attending a lot more conferences, and they do that, to mingle, to learn. So they're eager to learn.
Question from the back.
Thank you, Alexis. Thank you, YPI, for organizing this. My name is Bogdan. I agree with you, Betty, about the AI because I don't enjoy writing cover letters, and I don't know if people do, anybody does, but I've been using them for that. But even for cover letter, you're like, oh, there's something wrong. Like, check this, and it's even more important for a contract. But and I agree with your philosophy in terms of thinking in a positive sum way for legal outcomes and transactional practice, kind of. And I don't think everyone shares that philosophy, I'll just say, but I agree with it. I was just wondering if you could, given your sort of perch and sort of as a long-standing member in this practice and sort of going back to the years when I was starting in this country, if you could sort of help us see the forest for the trees a little bit from like the owner's perspective, if one were to decide, do you use public finance or project finance to, construct a piece of infrastructure? What are the determining factors for something like GDOT or other, governmental agencies or owners? Is it really tied to the contracting modality? Like if you do design build, it makes sense to do project finance, or is it more about fiscal capacity or credit rating or other factors? If you could just comment on that. Thank you.
I would say that it has to do more with credit capacity. I could be wrong, but that's what I think.
But in what sense?
And I don't know if do you want to?
I'm going to hold it off until the next YPI.
Because you guys actually are the ones that do that analysis.
Yeah. It's a good question, and I think credit capacity is one of the big constraints that folks look at. It's really hard to put your finger on it, right? Like we always said when we were starting up going back to 2005, when we were starting to sort of market P3s, the market, we were looking for desperate visionaries, right? So a lot of it is very, which goes to credit and it goes to leadership. So a lot of it is cultural. A lot of it is what you have available on hand. So political, cultural, what resources you have on hand, what you want your organization to be, right? If it's a DOT or a transit agency, right? How do you envision the future of your organization? It doesn't involve building your organization to do it all or use outside, support. And so it is, we have this concept of value for money and understanding whether the cost of capital outweighs the benefit of using a private contractor, right, or public-private partnership. And so we have those tools, but a lot of that is actually very subjective. And so it's a lot more of, yes, you can sort of look at it hard and fast, but there are also other considerations. And so it is, it makes it interesting. And in 1 second, you could have a leader say that makes absolute sense. And the next second, new administration, they're like, why the hell did we do this? And so, and then you have, so you're seeing parts of the country that don't have as long of a history in doing their own infrastructure, right? And so, New York area, we've done some P3, especially on the airport side, which has more of a context, more of sort of a private participation on a regular basis. But we also have our own toll agencies here, so on and so forth. And so areas of the country that are now developing at scale and growing more quickly and don't necessarily have that, some would call it expertise, some could call it baggage, have the ability to take a more rational approach. So there's a lot in there. But there's no perfect, formula for whether or not you do a P3 or not.
Yeah, there are a lot of benefits to public finance, but now as owners want to do so much. There's so much to do. That yes, they don't have the resources, like human or capital. And you really do get, if you drink the Kool-Aid, you really do get innovation. And SR 400 had an enormous concession payment that was given. So the state of Georgia got a lot out of SR 400.
An example that you gave me from early in your career is 288, where as I understand it, the private sector innovation delivered a technically better solution than the state thought was feasible,
Oh yeah, exactly. Oh, you good listener. Yeah. The developer, ACS, they did something I'm not remembering now. There was this huge interchange. I'm now forgetting the specifics. I don't know if you remember them, but anyway, yes, exactly. They sort of engineered something that really, that TxDOT hadn't even imagined was possible.
Thought wasn't possible, and the solution was better for users. Not only was it sort of better for revenue optimization, but users now have a better road because of the private sector innovation, which is the dream, right?
So there are a lot of reasons.
Any other questions from the crowd?
Thank you again for hosting this. My name is Joyce. I'm with Bank of America, and I do transportation public finance. So some of the projects that you guys mentioned are stuff that we work on. One of my questions for you is, Betty, you mentioned, obviously infrastructure demand is very high and it's going to be a need in the coming years. What do you see is the top infrastructure project? Which sector do you think is going to be more dedicated from a private investor perspective? Is it transportation, data center?
I do think it's transport. Oh, as opposed to data centers.
Or what?
I do think in general, transportation is a huge need, and a lot of the P3s in this country have revolved around transportation. So to me, it's the most mature market. It's the one that has evolved the fastest to me. So yeah.
And they're very big, and they're a bit hot right now.
Yeah, and they require a lot of equity, a lot of debt. So.
Thank you for hosting and for sharing your experience. Appreciate it. I wonder if you could share some lessons learned from the DB firm at GDOT, or any lessons learned that you could share with us. Thank you.
Lessons learned from what?
From the DB firm for GDOT. DBO.
Oh, lessons learned. You want to take that?
Yeah, yeah, happy to. That contract is public. There's certain things that we can't talk about, but I'm very proud that contract included a first of its kind NEPA risk share. We know in this room that NEPA, but environmental regulations, is a really difficult aspect for a lot of projects. And when you're talking about that innovation that we want from the private sector, how can you get the private sector to bring really innovative ATCs and ideas if all of the risk is on them? And so that contract includes a mechanism where, as part of the procurement process, GDOT worked with its bidders to assess some of the environmental risk around some of those ATCs. And then the winning bidder was able to avail themselves of certain risk sharing on some of those ATCs, so that if an ATC that had gone through that process was not able to get the need for approval, there is a sharing of that risk as opposed to all of that risk sitting with the contractor. So I think that's like a tangible, like you can go and read the terms. I think maybe the like emotional lesson learned or the approach lesson learned is sort of going back to what Betty was saying, like really listen to the counterparties. And GDOT really did listen and really understood that just being a brick wall, just saying we're not gonna share this, or just saying like no one's done this before, so we're not going to be the first ones, that wasn't going to get the best outcome for the state. And so there's a lot of benefit to be had in being open, listening, and being willing to put a bit of your own skin in the game and take on a bit of risk and be the first ones to do something. You get a good outcome. Yeah.
My name is Jack Lynch. I'm with Ernst & Young Infrastructure Advisory. So I have two questions, kind of go hand in hand. I hate when people do that, but one for each of you. So Alexis, maybe for you, a little more rudimentary. A junior or not a junior, a younger lawyer, what does the day-to-day look like? We interact with a lot of them as a financial advisor, but I'm genuinely curious, like what does that look like? And Betty, for you, maybe more dynamic, as you look at younger lawyers or you reflect back on yourself, you talked about your experience a little bit. What are some of the traits or experiences that you're looking at? I think I'm rambling, but one of the words I thought I found interesting from you is persuasion, that as a lawyer, one of the constant things you're doing is persuading your clients, right? What makes someone persuasive? What makes someone willing to listen to and good at that?
So you can't be persuasive unless you really, really have worked really hard to understand, whatever the contract is, like in incredible detail, unless you have to understand each provision from all the different sides, right? You really, really have to understand what you're talking about, what motivates, if, you're persuading an owner or a developer or a contractor, whoever it is that you're trying to persuade, you need to actually understand, is it right? Like, what position are you taking and why does it make sense? And be really truthful with yourself, because sometimes, sometimes you're working in a team and one of the, it could be good or it could be bad, right? Because sometimes, the first person talks and they say no, and then it's really hard. Like, that's not a problem I have, telling people they're wrong, but like sometimes the dynamics of a situation makes it hard to get to the right answer. So just like really, really, really understand the core of your position and really understand where the other side is coming from, and speak to that other side, because you have to convince them that, adopting this position makes sense to them. Mm-hmm. So it involves a lot of hard work.
That's great, because Betty's answer dovetails with mine, so I'm glad that I'm meeting her expectations. No, but I think, the life of a junior lawyer, I think, is similar to the life of a junior analyst or, a junior engineer. It's a lot of it is just getting the work done, translating, the big ideas into the minutia. And that's the day-to-day, but I think something that I have really come to understand is there is no shortcut for truly understanding something. And that, you can use AI to help you polish up a document, or, sometimes you're running out of time and you do just need to skim something. But to really solve a problem and ultimately, my job is to be part of the problem solving, you have to actually understand what the problem is on all sides of it. And that just takes time. It just takes reading and talking to other people and admitting that you don't understand. And like, I call up the financial advisors or I call up the engineers and I'm like, I'm really trying to do this materials indexation, but I don't know any of these words. And so, rely on others, but your goal should be to really understand something before you send it off to someone else.
And I think from a lawyer's perspective, to me, like every additional word actually has to give additional meaning, right? Like you really do have to sit there and think, well, what is this word adding that takes a really long time. But if you don't really understand what each additional word is getting you and how that relates to the big picture, if you're not constantly doing that, then you're not really understanding what you're doing. Evan?
Thank you both for having us. I noticed that for the GSR 400 project, I think they used the concessionaire model where the bidder paid a fee to run the operation. I got the impression that there was some interest in the industry of moving more away from concessionaire to more towards an availability payment model. I guess, whenever you're deciding what model of payment to use, how do you balance those that need to get skin in the game versus maybe in the face of industry pushback to not take on too much risk? And is that something that you experienced? And I guess do you see any shifts in that happening in the future?
I see, like, I'm a big fan of availability payment field, but I don't see that as the trend of the future because I see that a lot of owners are, seeing that however many billion concession payment and saying, well, I want more of the same and having the public pay for it. So I'm not seeing it. One of, I was talking earlier about success stories. I really do think that I-595 in Florida was absolutely a success story. And that was availability payment. So there are different reasons that,
And don't forget, SR 400 started off as availability payments.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, we acted on that as well. On it was first procured as an availability payment. And that procurement was not successful and it was restructured as a revenue risk.
These capital projects are getting so expensive that I just think using tools to help pay for it is going to be the way of the future. But availability payment is probably appropriate for other sectors. And it's probably, also appropriate for the right, we have a lot of different states with a lot of different agendas and points of view. So, yeah. And 595 closed during the financial crisis, right? So no toll road would have closed. No revenue risk would have closed at that time. So the availability payment structure is much more conservative.
And to your question about risk, then I guess it can also be like, what's the external risks? Not only what are the risks sort of this project, but what is happening in the world that may make a certain delivery model more viable than another at the time. So watch this space globally. I don't know.
Okay, great conversation. I think we can continue outside. We have a reception with food and drinks and continue networking. Thank you, and please a big applause for our speaker.
And I just want to say thank you again so much to YPI for organizing this. We're very excited to be the first of many, and I look forward to attending the Future Leadership Lab. So thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody.